Hey, I'm Sarah and we're talking creepypasta. Spread from teenager to teenager, creepypastas are a staple in a lot of Gen Z's and millennials' childhoods. Often depicted as something that preys on our most instinctive fears, they scare us away from the internet or any places that we feel most safe. They linger in the background of our minds, especially when we're alone. I'm looking at their creation, their intention, and a couple big ones that defined the genre. The term creepypasta comes from the term copypasta, which is a short form of media that gets copied and pasted all over the internet. Copypastas are big on internet web forums like 4chan and Reddit. The most popular one I can think of is being Rickrolled, which is in fact a copypasta, but so are a lot of things. But we're only looking at creepypastas here, so no need to get too deep on that one. I'm not going to talk about SCPs in this video. They most certainly are a form of creepypasta, but there are just so many, and I want to take the time to look at that at its own video. Creepypastas are their own form of urban legend. With the introduction of the internet, a new subgenre could be introduced and spread in a different, faster way. Some creepypastas are even way scarier than urban legends because of their authenticity coming directly from the source. Most of them are told in first person, like an anecdote, so you have to choose to trust the storyteller though you don't know them. Unlike urban legends, where the authenticity comes from the relation of the person to the storyteller, the friend of a friend effect, which I go into detail in my urban legends video if you're interested. The internet made the environment these stories are told in scary in a different way too. We're no longer huddled around a campfire late at night telling our friends stories for scares. We're now huddled around computer screens with our blankets the only thing defending us from the dark of our room. Although a lot of them have now been traced back to their original writers, a successful creepypasta is one that has no author. And what I mean by that is that it spreads with no recollection of who really originally posted it. It's what makes it so scary. It's like it came from nowhere. Some are attached to a specific picture that will travel with the story wherever it goes. Sometimes they'll reach out to you, the reader, and say that if you've seen this picture, that creature will be coming after you tonight, leaving you feeling unsafe in your own head. This might remind you of chainmail if you've ever experienced that. Chainmail consists of messages that are sent with the intention of being passed on to others through bribes or threats. Threats were the more effective ones. They work like in The Ring, where you have to pass it on in however much time before something will come get ya. They freaked me out as a kid, and I always passed them on. There's usually some story about a girl dying in a well or something vaguely similar, and if you don't pass this message on to 5 of your friends, she'll be in your room tonight. Not ideal for kids, especially if you were a little baby like I was. But this isn't creepypasta, it's different from chainmail. Chainmail is way more annoying. There actually was a TV show on Sci-Fi called Channel Zero that was fully an anthology series based on creepypastas. I haven't seen it even though I would love to. I don't have the streaming service you need, but it covers 4 creepypastas in its 4 total seasons. Candle Cove, which we'll talk more about in a little bit, The No End House, Search and Rescue Woods, and Hidden Door. The show actually has some pretty esteemed writers too. Don Mancini worked on it, who had a huge hand in the making of the Chucky movies and TV show, but it had a couple other esteemed writers from shows like Fear the Walking Dead, Hannibal, Haunting of Bly Manor, and some more Chucky writers. One of the most popular and influential creepypastas, in fact probably the most, would be Slender Man. If you haven't heard of creepypastas, you've probably still heard of and seen Slender Man. Online forums used to be really big in the 2000s, early 2010s era, and this is where a lot of creepypastas started. Slenderman in particular was first posted to the Something Awful forums under the name Victor Surge. Under a thread about scary paranormal pictures wanting to be posted, Victor Surge, or we now know his name is Eric Knudsen, posted these pictures of a tall, white, thin man who wore a suit and had no face and was luring children in. This spread quick, and all kinds of different media forums jumped on it, one being Everyman Hybrid, a YouTube channel that covered Slenderman and a couple other creepypastas like The Rake. They would slip in images of Slenderman into the background of their videos, mainly for scare factor, and it got very popular. Later on, they would only admit that they were faking them for views, just to say that they had accidentally garnered the attention of the real Slender Man. It wasn't just Everyman Hybrid that pushed this narrative. There were a lot of people saying online that our attention to Slender Man had actually either attracted him to us or had created him, like a tulpa. A tulpa is a Tibetan Buddhist entity that's basically the embodiment of thinking something so hard it becomes real. A good amount of people were peddling the idea that a tulpa, though they didn't always use that word, had formed from everyone's belief in Slender Man, now making him real. Weird, but whenever I'm talking about a tulpa, which is more often than you might think, I use Slender Man as an example. His figure was used in all types of media, as I said, and that extended to video games. In fact, that was probably one of his most popular mediums. A game called Slender, the 8 Pages, had the goal of finding the 8 pages that Slender Man had put around the woods without getting caught by him. It's the reason for the term, find my pages, if you've ever heard that. Now, I know I can't talk about Slender Man without talking about the Slender Man stabbing, but I am sick of hearing about it, so we're just gonna go over it quickly. In 2014, two 12-year-old girls, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weir, attempted to kill their friend, 12-year-old Peyton Leutner, in what Peyton believed was a game of hide-and-seek in the woods. Under the pretense that this was to appease Slender Man, Morgan stabbed her 19 times while Anissa watched and egged her on. They were later found in a nearby store with the knife still in hand. They told the police that they were on their way to meet Slender Man in Slender Mansion in a forest 200 miles away. Weird case. Obviously, these two already weren't mentally well, but sometimes creepypastas can draw out existing mental illnesses, which we'll talk more about in a bit. A very popular subgenre of creepypastas is the lost episode. If you ever heard about creepypastas when you were growing up, you probably heard one of these. They're generally supposed missing episodes from certain children's TV shows that become really dark in some way. The most popular ones I can think of off the top of my head are Suicide Squidward and Dead Bart. This subgenre can be disturbing because it's somewhat convincing that this missing episode may have existed at some point, but like childhood, it is unattainable in the present. They rely on nostalgia and highlight how broken and unreliable that nostalgia can be. It freaks you out by rebuilding your memory of childhood and twisting that into a traumatic recollection, holding both nostalgia and a form of childhood trauma. The best example of the lost episode, in my opinion, is and always will be Candle Cove. Different from most lost episodes, Candle Cove is actually a completely fictional show. The entire show isn't real, as opposed to what's usually a fake episode in an existing series. The form of how this one is told is what's so fascinating about it. It unfolded over multiple different users' posts to an online forum thread, and it started with the first person asking if anybody remembered this show from their childhood. Skyshale033, subject Candle Cove Local Kids Show. Does anyone remember this kids show? It was called Candle Cove, and I must have been 6 or 7. I never found reference to it anywhere, so I think it was on a local station around 1971 or 1972. I lived in Ironton at the time. I don't remember which station, but I do remember it was on at a weird time, like 4 p.m. Mike_Painter65, subject, reference, Candle Cove Local Kids Show. It seems really familiar to me. I grew up outside of Ashland and was 9 years old in 72. Candle Cove, was it about pirates? I remember a pirate marionette at the mouth of a cave talking to a little girl. Skyshale033, subject, reference, Candle Cove Local Kids Show. Yes, okay, I'm not crazy. I remember Pirate Percy. I was always kind of scared of him. He looked like he was built from parts of other dolls, real low budget. His head was an old porcelain baby doll, looked like an antique that didn't belong on the body. I don't remember what station this was. I don't think it was WTSF though. More and more people seem to recollect more about this show. They remember the ship, the laughingstock, the villain's sidekick, Horace Horrible, and the villain, a most certainly not kid-friendly character dubbed the Skin Taker. The members of the thread recall odd moments that stuck out in their memory, the Skin Taker proclaiming that his mouth was to grind your skin, and an entire episode where the characters were screaming for the whole duration. Jaren_2005, subject reference, Candle Cove Local Kids Show. Oh god, yes, the little girl Janice. I remember seeing her shake, and the Skin Taker screaming through his gnashing teeth, his jaw careening so wildly I thought it would come off its wire hinges. I turned it off and it was the last time I watched. I ran to tell my brother and we didn't have the courage to turn it back on. Mike_Painter65, subject, reference, Candle Cove Local Kids Show. I visited my mom today at the nursing home. I asked her about when I was little in the early 70s, when I was 8 or 9, and if she remembered a kids show, Candle Cove. She said she was surprised I could remember that, and I asked why, and she said, because I used to think it was so strange that you said, I'm gonna go watch Candle Cove now, Mom, and then you would tune the TV to static and just watch dead air for 30 minutes. You had a big imagination with your little pirate show. Awesome ending. It's actually believable because of the form it was shared in. The typos and lack of proper punctuation make it all the more authentic, just the perfect example of the lost episode. This stuff isn't restricted to just TV shows, of course. Subverted media takes all kinds of forms, and another big one being video games. There are some more popular ones, like the whole .exe thing. I'd say the most popular .exe game was Sonic.exe, which was just a Sonic game that was cursed somehow. Honestly, it wasn't a great creepypasta, but there are plenty of others. There's also the whole thing with the music in the Lavender Town level in a Pokemon game, supposedly leading to the deaths of 200 children. There's a possessed Mario 64 level that has disturbing visuals and whispering in Japanese over the titles. Just weird. While researching, I was reminded of the existence of Herobrine, who was just a white-eyed Steve in Minecraft. Didn't stop me from being scared of him as a kid. The best example for subverted games was Polybius, which was supposed to be an arcade game that would cause hallucination and amnesia in the players, kind of like the Pokemon Lavender Town level. They're all basically the same or have similar effects. I guess there's not too much creativity in those ones. Like with the Lost episode, creepypastas are usually aimed towards children for some reason. Maybe it's because they are more likely to believe it or more likely to be scared of it, but I think it's because for some odd reason, children crave fear. It's not necessarily that we wanted to be scared, but there's some kind of curiosity in us when we're kids and we think that we can handle everything. Playing games like Charlie Charlie and Bloody Mary, why do we do these scary things when they terrify us? I read this article on creepypastas and children's media, and it continuously refers to the figurative child. Society deems children a blank slate. When talking about children in general, there is a figurative child present in the conversation. They're usually the picture of pure innocence and thought of as white. This child is used as a rhetorical figure to damn certain societal behaviors and environments. Think about the children. Threats to this child reflect threats to our social structure or the presumably better future that the child represents. Okay, I know that was a lot, but stay with me. In creepypastas, there are usually some boundaries, not always because it's the internet, but there are typically some lines that they don't like to cross. Depictions of children suffering physical abuse are typically shied away from, but if that child were, say, supernatural or possessed, then it's fair game. As long as the child isn't seen as human, then we don't need to cross the line into worrying about that figurative child. We can instead put the blame on the supernatural or the entity possessing them. The figurative child is a potential object for corruption, too. The rules of the internet, a weird collection of rules that were passed around on 4chan, read Rule 43 as the more beautiful and pure a thing is, the more satisfying it is to corrupt it. This isn't necessarily saying to follow these rules, but these rules list observed internet behaviors. Perhaps that's why children in horror movies are so terrifying. Not necessarily just when they're in danger, but also when they're the bad guy. However, those rules of the internet also mention that there is a fine line between story and outright fictional exploitation, so basically, don't be weird. Sometimes creepypastas are not just harmless scares. They can draw out existing mental illnesses and twist them into something dangerous, like with the Slender Man stabbing. Oftentimes, I wouldn't say that it's the author's fault people are taking it too far, but in this particular case, I would. The Blue Whale Challenge was a list of increasingly difficult and darker tasks to complete over 50 days, the last one ending in taking one's own life. It's possible it started in Russia, depending on what story you believe, but we're gonna go with that narrative. On November 22nd, 2015, a girl named Rhianna Palyankova posted a selfie with her middle finger up, seemingly covered in caked blood, a black scarf over her mouth and her nose with the caption "Naya Bye." She took her life the next day. Online teenage forums would not stop talking about this and started making up their own stories about what happened to her. Not long after, another girl, Angelina Davidova, took her own life, and then another girl, Diana Kuznetsova, in the same city. When looking through the girls' belongings, police found that both of these girls had been a part of these online forums. The Russian news ended up reporting about 130 children's deaths linked to this game, which didn't really have a name at the time. The game spread to other countries, making that number higher, but there wasn't really a way to prove that those kids' deaths were because of that game, calling the number really into question. Especially because it seems that the game never really existed, at least not at first. There's no proof that that first girl, Rhianna Palyankova, had actually participated in the Blue Whale Challenge. In fact, there's no proof that it was even a thing before these teenagers were passing it around on web forums. There was an arrest made, though, for the creator of it, a 21-year-old man named... I'm not giving him any more attention he needs, no name. He supposedly created the game in 2013 because, and I quote, "There are people and then there's biodegradable waste. Sometimes I start to think that it's wrong, but in the end, I had the feeling that I was doing the right thing." Yeah, okay, dude. It's very possible, and I honestly believe this, that this guy did not create the Blue Whale Challenge, but admitted to it, because he's a struggling artist. The teens that were actually participating were most likely already depressed and mentally ill, and the game drew more out of them. The problem here is mental illness in teenagers, not just the game, although it most certainly is a problem too. Although a lot of the hard information people could find on the game was passed around by 12 to 14-year-olds online, so who really knows what's real? Creepypastas, unlike urban legends, were manufactured in bulk and sent off on the internet to do its thing and spread. Talking about one in particular, smile.jpg, or Smile Dog, was about a researcher looking into this image that would haunt the person that saw it. It would tell people to spread the word, meaning to send it to more people, kind of like chainmail, except this was a fictional occurrence, if that makes sense. The story would always be followed around by the picture itself, which I'm gonna show you now, so if you don't want to see it, look away, I guess. This picture scared so many people, and it's not really scary to look at now compared to the lots of art that we now have access to. People have gotten way better with Photoshop and creepy images. Supposedly, if you saw this picture, you were hit with the immediate feeling of intense anxiety and a sudden onset of temporal lobe epilepsy. If you didn't feel all that when looking at it, then you were looking at a fake, not the original one. That leaves room for disbelief to be proved wrong. If you think the story's fake because you didn't feel anything looking at it, you're just looking at the wrong one. In the story, spreading the word will either get Smile Dog to leave you alone, or it was out of an almost religious fascination, needing everyone to see the beauty of the thing, kinda like Bird Box. What was scary about this one is that it made you start to wonder, maybe the effects just haven't hit me yet, or what if that was the real picture I was looking at and that thing could crawl into my head at any second? It made you lose any sense of security that you felt inside your own head or any safe place. And now, some of my favorites. Mr. Widemouth is told by a man revisiting his childhood time with a rough case of mononucleosis, and the friend that appeared to comfort him in this time, Mr. Widemouth. He was a tiny creature with a wide mouth, overall resembling a Furby. Mr. Widemouth would always encourage the boy to engage in these dangerous games. He would take him to a high window and tell him to imagine a trampoline below and jump. You'll bounce right back up. He'd bring in a box of knives and tell the boy that he wanted to teach him how to juggle. The boy would always refuse, but Mr. Widemouth was consistent. I started having trouble sleeping after that. Mr. Widemouth often woke me up at night, saying that he put a real trampoline under the window, a big one that I couldn't see in the dark. I always declined and tried to go back to sleep, but Mr. Widemouth persisted. Sometimes he stayed by my side until early in the morning, encouraging me to jump. He wasn't so fun to play with anymore. My mother came to me one morning and told me I had her permission to walk around outside. She thought the fresh air would be good for me, especially after being confined in my room for so long. Ecstatic, I put on my sneakers and trotted out to the back porch, yearning for the feeling of sun on my face. Mr. Widemouth was waiting for me. "I have something I want you to see," he said. I must have given him a weird look, because he then said, "It's safe, I promise." I followed him to the beginning of a deer trail which ran through the woods behind the house. "This is an important path," he explained. "I've had a lot of friends about your age. When they were ready, I took them down this path to a special place. You aren't ready yet, but one day I hope to take you there." I return to the house, wondering what kind of place lay beyond the trail. The boy never learns what's at the end of the trail during his time there because his family ends up moving out a couple weeks later. He watches Mr. Widemouth in his childhood bedroom as they drive away, waving to him with a steak knife in hand. The story has a time skip to when the boy is an adult and he comes back to see where his old home used to be. Out of curiosity, he goes down that deer trail that Mr. Widemouth had showed him to find a graveyard at the end, many graves belonging to children. I love imaginary friend horror. It's the whole question of, was Mr. Widemouth really real? Did he have a physical body? If he was just imaginary, how did he bring in the box of knives? This one is pretty well written, not dragging on too long like many do, but keeping in the essentials. The ending is eerie, but not necessarily scary. It's just the perfect ending without going too far overboard. However, the drawings you might see of people's interpretations of him remind you that he's just a little gremlin-looking thing, so he's not too scary anymore. When I got the first one, I was literally seconds away from stepping onto the plane when a call from unknown blared from my cell phone. It was a ringtone I hadn't heard before, one I was pretty sure hadn't come with the phone. Normally, I wouldn't have stopped to answer it, but I was expecting a call about a job I had interviewed for the previous week. I took a deep breath and accepted the call. Hello? Do not get on the plane. A woman's voice, garbled and strange, as if her vocal cords had been shredded and she was trying desperately to choke out speech. Despite the unnerving, fractured quality of her voice, her tone was insistent and eerily calm. Then the call ended. I froze. I had always had a slight phobia of air travel, and something about this call just... There's no way I was about to get on a 7-hour flight now. I turned around and headed toward the food court. I'd just get another flight later in the afternoon, I figured. I watched from the airport Starbucks 3 hours later as every TV in the terminal lit up with the crash footage of the plane I should have been on. No survivors, not a single one. I tried to trace the call, so did the police, but there was nothing to trace. There was no evidence my phone had ever received a call around that time. They analyzed phone records, incoming and outgoing communication to my phone. Nothing. I wasn't making it up. I couldn't have been. That wasn't the only call. Throughout the years, they were very few and far between, but always right. And I always listened. Lost some footage, so enjoy the rest of this story from here. Do not go on that blind date tonight. 5 months later, my would-be date was convicted of killing 4 women, all with my hair color and build. Found them in a shallow grave about 250 feet from the diner he offered to take me to. Do not drive to the concert tonight. 18-wheeler lost control and plowed into a line of cars, every driver crushed, every driver killed, in the stretch of freeway I would have been driving down. No matter if I got a new phone, if I moved across the country, the calls would still come. I could almost feel the presence of whatever it was, whatever it is, watching over me. I imagined being at the bottom of the freezing ocean, still strapped into my coach section plane seat, or being in that mass grave across from the diner, or watching an 18-wheeler skidding toward my car, knowing death was imminent, and I'd get this tightness in my chest. I'd think about how thin that line was, how close I'd gotten. If I hadn't had a job interview I was waiting to hear back from, I'd have never listened to that first call, and that would have been it for me. It always felt like something was coming for me, that there was always this fractured, warped voice with these calls that never seemed to exist after I heard them. Self-destructing warning signals, rotting away before my eyes, and I was alive. I had a bad feeling about this cruise. I had planned it as a girls' week, out with some of my old friends from college, and was looking forward to a week in the tropics in the dead of winter, but part of me could almost sense that the call was coming. Maybe I'd watched Titanic one too many times, but there was a little nagging fear from the start. I hoped it would be fine, but I knew that if something was going to happen, I'd get the call. I'd know. Now, a week before I'm set out to go to the cruise, after stepping into my apartment, after returning from dinner with a friend, I notice my cell has a message from unknown. They've never had to leave a message before. Haven't checked it all night. Damn it, and I really wanted to go on that cruise too. Well, not worth whatever horrific fate awaited me in that cold, dark ocean. I click play message and feel my stomach drop as I listen to the voice, sounding horrifically distorted, as if it emanates from a throat slashed to ribbons, crackling with more urgency than ever before. I look around my apartment as the voice on the phone repeats the same phrase over and over again. Do not come home after dinner tonight. Do not come home after dinner tonight. Do not come home after dinner tonight. I first heard this one on the Smoshmouth podcast, same with Mr. Widemouth, and this one affected me in a way I hadn't felt from one before. Something about it genuinely struck a chord with me. It's ridiculously scary, but not necessarily in a way that I feel unsafe. I'm not worried that I'm going to start getting these calls, but something about the voice, the twist, and the fact that the voice on the other end of the phone was never actually safe, it just rips any security blanket away that the story had built up for you. God, it's freaky, and very Final Destination-esque. Borrasca follows Sam Walker from the age of 9 to roughly 26. As a kid, he moves to the town of Drisking and meets his best friends Kyle Landy and Kipper DeStaro. As children, they engage in weird traditions in the woods and talk about the consistent random screeching sounds coming from the tailed Borrasca. Borrasca, whether it's a place or a thing, is somehow related to the skinned men and the shiny gentlemen, characters that children would use as punishment in their games. As people go missing in the town, Sam, Kyle, and Kimber try to figure out what's going on in Drisking and where their family and friends are disappearing to. We're not reading this one, it's ridiculously long, but it's a very good example of a good long creepypasta. Split into 5 parts, Borrasca is less of a creepypasta and more of a short story or novel. It's insane that we have access to a story like this just for free, just because the author published it online. It's honestly seen more like a novel now, but I still think it's so cool that a story like this was published in this format. It began with 4 parts when published in 2015, but the story got so much love that the author C.K. Walker wrote a 5th part in 2016 to finish out the story and give it a more satisfying ending. I won't spoil it here, but it's a very well written story, forgoing some of the typos. I had heard so many good things about Borrasca for so long, but I had never actually taken the time to sit down and read it. However, now that I've sat and forced myself to read it, I am so glad I did. It is a first-person point of view horror show, and it's sickening to learn the truths about what's happening in Drisking. I'll warn you though, a lot of the subject matter is very heavy, particularly with SA and violence against women. If you can read it, be cautious, but do it. Its horror is rooted in a hopelessness that frustrates you and unsettles you. The characters are distinct and likable, and the twists are genuinely shocking and horrifying. In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientist had theorized that a human without access to any senses or any ways to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed that the 5 senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no other possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world, he was alone with his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to his concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking to him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but not convinced until the subject started naming their dead relatives. He repeated personal information to them that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. Apparently, in every waking moment, his consciousness was being bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit a pain response, and begged the scientists for sedatives so that he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for 3 days, until he started having severe night terrors. He repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. Now hysterical, he said that the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientists rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to a table so he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, he had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head, and despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with the scientist for the first time in the study. He whispered, "I have spoken with God, and he has abandoned us." And his vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death. So I wanted to read the Russian sleep experiment, but that one is 12 minutes long, so I opted for this one instead. Another one in the long list of experiment creepypastas. This one is still one of the most popular OGs. It reminds me of the Portrait of God short film, which if you haven't seen and you want to be scared, go watch it. These experiment ones are really interesting, but sometimes it can go on for a bit too long. This one kind of balances it out pretty well, not dwelling too long on the decaying signs of the subject. The Russian sleep experiment, in my opinion, yaps for quite long, but what do I know? It's also a very weird concept, but you can kind of see where it's coming from. Do I think our 5 senses are what's blocking us from God? No, obviously, but it's still a very interesting premise, and it makes sense in a way. Although, how did God talk to him if he had abandoned them? You can't really think about creepypastas for too long or they lose their fear factor. Once again, stop believing everything you see on the internet. Please.